In this section, we will discuss why agencies forecast air quality and how those forecasts are used. There are two primary reasons for forecasting air quality: to protect public health and to support emissions reductions programs. When forecasts are issued to protect public health, the public can plan activities to avoid exposure, and sensitive individuals can plan activities in healthcare. For supporting emissions reduction programs, participation in such programs depends on forecast accuracy and timeliness. The public's activities are affected, and sponsor or donor agency support can be affected as well. It is important for forecasts to protect public health because particle pollution has many physical effects. It can aggravate heart diseases. It is associated with cardiac arrhythmias and heart attacks. It aggravates lung diseases such as asthma and bronchitis. It can decrease lung function, causes airway inflammation, and it increases susceptibility to respiratory infections. By having forecasts for air quality, this allows the public to plan activities to avoid exposure to unhealthy air, can plan when they are going to be outside, and they can make decisions about their health and medical care. The forecasts are used by air quality agencies, specifically the Communications Office, the media, such as television, newspaper, radio, and internet websites, the public, both the general public and sensitive individuals, and schools, such as when planning for outdoor activities. Critical forecast issues include timeliness. The users need to have the forecast by a certain time of the day in order to make use of it. Localized forecasts can be needed depending on the range of air quality conditions in a given area. Multi-day forecasts can be very useful for planning purposes, anywhere from 1 day in advance to 5 days in advance. And finally, you want your forecast to be in an easy-to-understand format. Now let's talk about operating emissions reduction programs. There are two types of programs, both voluntary and mandatory. The voluntary programs are not required, and these are sometimes called Action Day programs. Mandatory programs, on the other hand, are required, and people or industries can be fined if they are caught not participating in these programs. Forecasts are needed for advanced planning to prepare for the communication and taking action when these programs are in place, and you need to notify any stakeholders. Critical forecast issues are that participation depends on forecast timeliness and accuracy. If your forecasts are not accurate, you're less likely to have the public helping to participate and reduce their emissions. And then finally, emissions are affected by these programs, which can impact your forecast verification. If you get enough of a response from people participating and trying to reduce their emissions, your forecast level of air quality may not be reached. An example of a voluntary emissions reduction program is the Spare the Air program in Sacramento, California. The objective of this program is to seek public involvement to voluntarily reduce emissions on forecasted Spare the Air days. An example of a mandatory emissions reduction program is the Washington State County's burn ban programs. This objective is to reduce emissions to comply with federal standards. So how are these forecasts used to support the emissions reduction programs? Spare the Air Day program is triggered by a one-day forecast. In other words, the forecast that is issued today is to support a Spare the Air Day tomorrow. On Spare the Air Days, the public is notified by television, public service announcements, radio, newspaper, fax, and web postings. The public is asked to reduce emission-producing activities by doing things such as reducing driving by carpooling and taking public transit, and reducing the use of paints and solvents. With any voluntary emissions reduction program, it is important to evaluate the results of this program to make sure it is meeting the needs of the agency. This graph that you see on screen right now is showing the results of a survey comparing the number of people who said they drove less on Spare the Air days compared with non-Spare the Air days. By evaluating this reduction in driving on program action days, you can then calculate the estimated reduction in emissions as a result of your emissions reduction program. This graphic shows an example of results from a mandatory emissions reduction program in Melbourne, Australia. The plot on the left shows the expected pollution levels with no mandatory emissions reductions, while the plot on the right shows the expected pollution levels with a 25% reduction in driving. In addition to these Action Day programs, where it's pretty continual that every time pollution levels are expected to reach a certain level, certain actions are triggered, there can be special sampling programs as well. There are several types of special programs, such as localized special monitoring, regional monitoring, and field studies. Forecasts are needed for advanced planning to prepare monitoring equipment, such as aircraft, samplers, or other sensors. In addition, you may need to sample pre-episode conditions, such as the day before high air quality concentrations. Critical forecast issues for special sampling programs include obtaining a very detailed forecast, much more so than what you may need for your day-to-day public forecast, and allowing sufficient time to prepare monitoring equipment and personnel. There may be cases where you need to issue a critical forecast several days in advance. This photograph is from a study of power stations in the Latrobe Valley of Victoria, Australia. You can see the plane is flying between two stacks. Winds and air pollution forecasts are used in the design of day-by-day sampling strategies in major studies, providing data for impact assessments for new industries or expansions of industrial facilities. So to summarize, air quality forecasts enable public planning and action, such as planning activities, exposure avoidance, and healthcare. Forecasts are used by air quality agencies, the media, the public, industries, and schools. And critical forecast issues include timeliness, localized forecasts, multi-day forecasts, and having your forecast in an easy-to-understand format that's tailored to the audience who is receiving the forecast.